When we talk about the possibility of war between Iran and a joint military force led by the United States and Israel, we are not discussing a sudden or isolated crisis, but the culmination of decades of ideological hostility, strategic mistrust, nuclear anxiety, regional proxy battles, and political rhetoric that has steadily hardened over time. And to understand the gravity of such a confrontation, we have to trace the deeper currents that have shaped this triangle of tension, especially the long-standing warnings and aggressive posture articulated over the years by figures such as Donald Trump, who repeatedly framed Iran as one of the most dangerous actors in the Middle East and insisted that its nuclear ambitions could never be allowed to mature into weapons capability. The roots of this confrontation stretch back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when Iran transformed from a pro-Western monarchy into an Islamic republic built on resistance to American influence and open hostility toward Israel, fundamentally reshaping the regional balance of power and embedding ideological conflict into foreign policy. From that moment forward, Washington and Tehran became strategic adversaries, and Israel increasingly viewed Iran not just as a rival state, but as an existential threat because of its rhetoric, its support for armed groups surrounding Israeli borders, and its long-term missile development program. Over the decades, this hostility evolved from direct diplomatic severance into shadow warfare, including sanctions, cyber operations, covert strikes, assassinations of nuclear scientists, maritime confrontations in the Gulf, and indirect conflict through proxy militias in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. When Trump first entered office years ago, he withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, arguing that the agreement failed to permanently block Iran's path to a bomb and did nothing to curb missile expansion or regional destabilization. And that decision marked a turning point because it replaced conditional engagement with maximum pressure, reimposing sanctions designed to economically suffocate Tehran and force renegotiation from a position of weakness. From Iran's perspective, this proved that Washington could not be trusted to honor agreements, and from the American and Israeli perspective, Iran's subsequent uranium enrichment increases confirmed suspicions that its nuclear program was never purely civilian. In analyzing the possibility of open war, the first key dimension is strategic objectives, because each side calculates risk differently. The United States seeks to prevent nuclear proliferation, protect regional allies, maintain freedom of navigation in oil transit routes, and deter attacks on its forces. Israel prioritizes preventing any scenario in which Iran acquires nuclear weapons or advanced missile systems capable of overwhelming its defenses. Iran, meanwhile, focuses on regime survival, deterrence through asymmetry, and projecting influence to avoid encirclement by hostile powers. These objectives collide most sharply around the nuclear question because enrichment capability is seen by Tehran as sovereign technological progress and by Washington and Jerusalem as a threshold to weaponization. If conflict were to erupt into direct warfare, it would likely begin not with ground invasion but with air and cyber campaigns, targeting nuclear facilities, missile sites, command structures, air defenses, and naval assets. The United States possesses overwhelming conventional superiority in stealth aircraft, carrier strike groups, long-range bombers, and satellite surveillance, while Israel contributes intelligence depth, precision strike capability, and regional experience. Iran, however, would not fight symmetrically, instead relying on ballistic missile barrages, drone swarms, cyber retaliation, disruption of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and activation of allied militias across multiple fronts to stretch defenses thin. One of the most dangerous elements in this equation is escalation control, because once missiles begin flying, political leaders must decide whether to limit objectives to deterrence or pursue regime-changing blows, and history shows that wars often expand beyond initial plans due to miscalculation, domestic pressure, or unintended casualties. A strike intended as a warning could be interpreted as an existential assault, prompting retaliation that crosses red lines and triggers a wider regional conflagration. Oil markets would react instantly, with even temporary closure of the Strait of Hormuz sending energy prices sharply upward, fueling inflation worldwide and testing fragile economies, particularly in Europe and Asia, which depend heavily on Gulf exports. Another layer of complexity is the role of global powers such as Russia and China, both of which maintain strategic ties with Tehran and might not enter direct combat but could provide diplomatic cover, economic lifelines, or military technology transfers, thereby transforming a regional war into a broader geopolitical confrontation between power blocs. This is especially significant in a world already strained by great power competition, where crises are rarely isolated and often intersect with global rivalries. Trump's long-standing rhetoric about Iran has consistently emphasized strength, unpredictability, and deterrence through overwhelming force, arguing that clarity about American willingness to strike prevents adversaries from miscalculating. Yet critics argue that such rhetoric can also narrow diplomatic space and reinforce hardliners within Iran who thrive on confrontation. In Tehran, political factions often consolidate around external threats, using them to suppress dissent and rally national unity, meaning that military pressure does not automatically translate to political collapse. Israel's calculation is shaped by geography and history because it lacks strategic depth and perceives even small existential risks as unacceptable, which explains its willingness historically to conduct preemptive strikes when nuclear proliferation looms. However, Iran's facilities are deeply buried, dispersed, and defended, making any military campaign complex and potentially prolonged. And even a successful strike might only delay rather than eliminate nuclear capability, raising the question of whether war solves the problem or entrenches it. Public opinion also matters, particularly in the United States, where memories of prolonged Middle Eastern wars generate caution among voters, and any administration must weigh domestic tolerance for casualties and economic disruption. Similarly, Iranian society faces economic hardship from sanctions, yet nationalist sentiment can surge during external attack, complicating assumptions that internal unrest would weaken the regime during conflict. The cyber dimension cannot be overlooked, as modern warfare includes attacks on financial systems, power grids, communications networks, and satellite infrastructure, meaning that civilians far from the battlefield could experience blackouts, banking interruptions, or information warfare campaigns. In such an environment, distinguishing military from civilian targets becomes increasingly difficult, raising humanitarian and legal challenges. There are several plausible scenarios in a hypothetical war trajectory: a short, sharp exchange followed by mediated ceasefire, a prolonged air and missile campaign with limited ground engagement, or a spiraling regional war drawing in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Gulf states, creating multiple simultaneous fronts. The most dangerous path would involve misinterpretation of intentions, such as assuming that limited strikes signal regime change, prompting escalation to strategic missile use that forces counter-escalation. Deterrence theory suggests that both sides might ultimately avoid total war because the costs are enormous and unpredictable. Yet deterrence can fail if leaders believe the other side is about to cross a point of no return, particularly regarding nuclear breakout timelines. Intelligence assessments about enrichment levels, weaponization capability, and delivery systems become pivotal, and uncertainty in those assessments increases the temptation for preemptive action. Economically, Iran would face severe infrastructure damage and further isolation, while the United States would confront market volatility and global diplomatic backlash, and Israel would endure missile saturation testing its air defense systems at unprecedented scale. Humanitarian consequences across the region could include displacement, supply chain breakdowns, and civilian casualties, intensifying international pressure for ceasefire. Ultimately, the central question is whether military confrontation eliminates or entrenches the nuclear dilemma, because history shows that states under existential threat sometimes accelerate rather than abandon strategic weapons programs. Thus, policymakers must calculate whether force delays proliferation at the cost of long-term instability, or whether sustained diplomatic containment, however frustrating, offers a more durable path. The tension between Iran, the United States, and Israel represents a classic security dilemma in which each side's efforts to increase its own safety decreases the perceived safety of the others, creating a cycle of armament, suspicion, and brinkmanship.